Gregathon, the methodical American macro machine, is going to be taking on TSL Clide in this edition of the Gregathon, the series in which I take a look back at every GSL game IdrA's ever played. Now, this is an important season in GSL history. This is 2011 January. This was the first true GSL Code S they had. They did 3 GSLs in 2010. Remember, StarCraft came out in late July of 2010. And those were open brackets, straight up single limb bracket all the way through. This was the Code S format that you're more used to, where there were groups and there were qualifiers that had to do with your rank from last season. Like, for instance, if you made top 4, you're grandfathered in. It's not as easy as a big open bracket in terms of it was way easier to qualify for the GSL when it was an open bracket. Now, the groups are a little bit weird. They're not the traditional GSL style groups you're used to. They play best of ones, which is really, really weird to think about. But it is what it is. The GSL style was evolving before it finally sort of hit the peak and they got everything really figured out. Of course, they tried to do the whole Code A bit from 2011 to like 2012, and that was kind of weird. This was the peak era of the GSL, in my opinion, in terms of the amount of hype and the amount of wonder and the amount of foreigners that were involved in the GSL. Never again would we see so many non-Koreans fighting in the GSL at such a high level. Now, I think the other time the GSL was at its most entertaining was right when HOTS came out, and I'm doing another series on my channel, which you should subscribe to and click the bell notification so you don't miss any of these upcoming videos, which I'm going to be releasing very frequently in the coming month. Where I have the Gregathon, which is what you're watching now, and then I have the Innovation-a-thon, which is where I take a look at every game Innovation played in the first GSL season of Heart of the Swarm, and that's when all the Gosu Korean players that were in Kespa teams and stuck playing Brood War finally switched over. So like Flash, Innovation, all those legendary guys like Bisu, Rain. That's the season when all those cats switched over. And that was like a different sort of wonder, because from the time Wings of Liberty beta was out till the end of Wings of Liberty, people would always say, man, what would Jaedong do in this situation? What would it be like if Flash switched over? He'd be so much better than everyone. Yeah, guys like MVP and Life and Stefano were gods in the game of 2012, but how good would Bisu and Flash and these cats be if they switched over? And this was something that was always talked about and bandied about, and then it finally happened in early Heart of the Swarm. And in addition to Terran being extremely powerful, this led to a situation where the GSO was probably at its most fun to watch, because you had all the god tier old names from Wings of Liberty, like Life and MVP and these guys, and then you had all the new legends coming over that you really wanted to see how they were going to do. As we see IdrA on Xel'Naga Caverns here is trying to deny the scouting. We're seeing a Rax expand in base from Clide here, which is standard. Xel'Naga, very open natural. It's very common to go Hellions on this map, in the same way that it's good for Zerg to be able to pressure because it's open. Hellions just shut that down and can pressure the Zerg very well, because Terran and Protoss players will sit there and say, well, my god, this natural is so open, how am I supposed to defend it? You have to consider that when it gets to a certain amount of openness, it's also hard for Zerg to defend. And this is one of the things that we would see on this map, was low ground walls being used to help supplement the low ground defense. And what I mean by that is, now you always see people build stuff on their high ground. Well, the distance between the base of the natural ramp and the side of the CC when it lands is a few buildings wide. So if you can place your buildings to the side, you can have a wall that ends with the command center, and then you can have like a bunker behind that and defend from run-bys. But this is what Zerg is supposed to do on an open map like this. On other maps like Lost Temple and Shakuras and Steps of War and other maps that were played at this time, the natural, even if it's has a short rush distance from natural to natural, the ability to be able to defend it is also based on how open it is. So it's actually easier for like a Terran or Protoss player to take their natural on Steps of War, even though the rush distance is much shorter because of how open the natural is. And on this map, it was like, yeah, IdrA denied the natural for a couple of 3 minutes, but now that 4 Hellions are out, all of his speedlings are offensively worthless, and now the big natural is going to be taken advantage of. But notice how his spine popped right whenever the Terran player aggressed. Perfect timing from IdrA, who's going to try to trap the Hellions in the back corridor, but you don't want to run off creep. And brilliant defense from IdrA. This is one of those things that's existed since Wings of Liberty and is still true, but if right whenever your attack hits, the units are popping and the spines are finishing, it means that the Zerg perfectly delayed as long as they could, and then right whenever you were ready to hit, the defense was sprung. Zerg is all about delaying, especially in this era with short rush distance and players really liking to put pressure on. And Clide's thinking about it here, and this is what I meant. Look how wide open the natural is for IdrA. Hellions are so good on this map, and notice Clide's not doing the standard, oh, I'm going to make 6 Hellions just to control the map. He's making a lot. And this is something that you could do that was before the Hellbat existed. You had Blue Flame, which was way more popular and powerful, but if you wanted to go one factory, you could mix in Marauders, and this was an old school Marauder Hellion timing. The idea being that the Hellions destroy Lings and the Marauders destroy Roaches. So if Zerg doesn't have mutas out, you counter everything they have. And this is a pre-muta timing. This is sort of like a I'm going to hit right before you get mutas out timing, because the Zerg is going to be on pure Lings, and IdrA's going to run in here with some Ling muta. Thank God the spine is southbound, helping him a bit. And the idea here for the macro machine is to kill all the anti-air, but that's a crapload of Hellion Marauder remaining, and the spines are going to try to kill the Hellions as they scream up into the natural. And IdrA's desperately trying not to lose every drone he has. He has lost a few. And remember, the Queen does only have 3 anti-melee range, so it's just pretty worthless on the ground defense-wise. That's why whenever the Hellion aggression was started, IdrA just didn't have 4 Queens out there to deflect it. The Queen in this era, lower range against ground and air. This made it where you couldn't just spam them. And this was a huge reason why Zerg was worse, because now we see Zergs just make 5 Queens. Whenever your first push hits his Terran, the Zerg already has a plethora of Queens, and even though they mess transfuse, it doesn't really matter in terms of how good the Queen is overall. Mutaling is going to jump forward here, and IdrA wants to try to prevent turrets from coming up. This is one of those situations where if you can prevent the turrets, the Terran doesn't have enough production, and very much like a Brood War game, you can just sit on top of the production. This is what happens when you do a big Marauder Hellion all-in, and it fails. It just barely failed, but this is what happens. You delay your eBay, you delay your turrets, you straight up skip medevacs, you don't have the armory for Thor, and everything you're doing army-wise is to counter the Zerg ground. And IdrA's in a situation where he was going air, and right before the push hit, his mutas got out. If his spines weren't placed as well as they could have been, or they were, he might have died. As you see a couple mutas fall here, and this is that tricky situation where you actually do want to fight mutas into Marines because it's so ridiculously low econ. Is this is looking a lot like a Brood War game, as the mutas are camping over the Terran production. The Terran's trying to sort of make a bunch of turrets because he's being abused by mutas. Mutas in StarCraft 2 were not nearly as microable or good as they were in StarCraft 1. As we see, IdrA's at a worker disadvantage. He took a pretty severe clip from those Hellions. He is getting a third, but this was so early on in StarCraft 2's life that even the top tier macro players didn't hotkey eggs. As we can see, IdrA had some mutas out there just sitting by his rally points, and IdrA, even in the early days of the game, was a top tier macro player who beat people with his mechanics. And this was a big interesting part of the beginning of the game, as you see another Rax fall here, and this is a weird situation where the Terran's just losing all of his production. And we saw macro mechanics develop throughout the game, month by month, week by week. But back in this time, the game had been out for a few months. People hadn't mastered macro mechanics yet in terms of taking advantage of unlimited building select and being able to hotkey eggs and stuff like this. Because you would just never do that in Brood War. That you would do what IdrA was doing, where you would just make stuff out of the hatches and have it rally and hotkey it as it came in. Hotkeying eggs wasn't something that was done in StarCraft 2 until several months into the game. And you even weirdly for a while had people doing stuff like hotkeying hatches to different keys and then jumping, like double tapping that key to jump between the bases. Because you had Brood War, this great game that everyone had sort of figured out like the way you were supposed to play. The trick was actually doing it. And then a lot of times people would just take what they did from Brood War and try that in StarCraft 2 for the first few months of this game. And what it resulted in was some weird looking games like this, where IdrA delayed Baneling Nest severely. He hasn't made a Baneling all game, he's just now getting Baneling speed. And we saw the Terran do a crisp, sharp timing that was very similar. Look at all these racks behind the mineral line, that's hilarious. IdrA has been harassing so intelligently and fastidiously that the Terran player has essentially lost all production, and he's had to make like 50 turrets just to try to survive. And he just can't get up to medevac. IdrA's harassing him so viciously. And he can't get Thor. You see he's getting an armory now, but whenever you do a big push like that and it's all ground, and it fails, you don't have any anti-air. And since IdrA defended with mutas, it's not like he defended with a bunch of Ling Bane and then made mutas and the Terran was able to sort of like, oh shit, he's coming, get my turrets up. No, the mutas flew right across the map, and the map's rush distance is way shorter than they were in today's game. So that's weird, where it's bad for Zerg, but then like when Zerg holds a big attack and they counterattack, suddenly the Terran doesn't have as much time to produce. This has looked a lot like a Brood War game. This reminds me of that +1 5 racks timing Terran players will do to try to hit Zergs in their weak point right before they can get to muta, and this was a tactic that we saw that was incredibly popular in the Brood War metagame about 3 years ago. You don't really see it so much anymore, but that was sort of the intellectual successor to that in many ways. That sort of hellion Marauder timing, which is brutal, because if the Zerg's going Roach, the Marauders destroy him, and of course he's going to have Lings in some regards. You make 8 to 10 Hellions, the Hellions are going to destroy the Lings. And it's just such a brutal push because it's supposed to hit before Spire. And you might be asking, well, why didn't it hit before Spire? It's because IdrA sat out there and delayed his natural. This was one thing about playing in this era as Zerg, is you would do a lot of little things to take little advantages, and then because the maps were small and the meta was Terran and Protoss favored, a lot of times you would have to do a bunch of little things well consecutively and scout well and not get supply blocked to eventually be able to hold. It's like you do all those things right, and those little macro advantages cascade and cascade and cascade, and then that's how you're able to hold. Because on maps like this, maps like Steps of War, if you're just playing, oh, we see a big engagement here, Mutaling screaming forward with some Banelings bringing up the rear, and hilariously 3 turrets just sitting there between the 3rd gold and the natural, as the golden boy of Tastosis, TSL Clide, is getting crushed by the foreigner here. Tastosis and Tastosis just love this guy. I mean, Clide was like Nest T before Nest T started winning. As IdrA runs the speed bans in and cleans up virtually everything. Clide's down to 24 workers, and I don't know if you guys noticed this, but IdrA was behind in workers from the moment that Marauder Hellion push concluded. GG's called there, Greg Fields wins. From the moment that push ended to like 5 more minutes, IdrA was behind in workers. He was cutting every corner, getting out every muta he could, using all of his APM and harassing. And that looked a lot like a Brood War game. If you ever watch Tastosis play against a muta player in Brood War, and it looks a lot like this game, because remember, there's no Widow Mines at the time. There's no Liberators at the time. So the way that Terrans would deal with this is it was like, oh, well, if you couldn't defend it with Marine Medevac, and remember, he delayed his starport to do that push, you would get a Thor. Well, if you do that push, you delay an Armory too. See, that's one thing that people don't really consider about StarCraft, especially the people who don't play a lot of the game, is especially with like Protoss All In, it's like, oh, that feels unbeatable, like how can they do that? That's bullshit. Well, a lot of times in StarCraft, if you're going to do something that's strong, you're giving up other things to do it. In this game, we saw TSL Clide, the beloved Terran player. He said, this map's really good for Hellions. You know it's IdrA and he likes to go Muta. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a Marauder Hellion push that's going to hit right before the Mutas come out. I'm going to have 10 Hellions that are just going to roast his Lings. And then if he has any other ground stuff, the Marauders will clean it up. What am I giving up for that though? Because that push almost killed IdrA. It was one of those things, if he had gotten supply blocked or not scouted it, he just would have gotten ran over. So what did Clide give up? He gave up an armory. He gave up getting better upgrades as far as an earlier +1. He gave up teching into starport. If you delay your starport and the Zerg gets to your side of the map with mutas, you're going to have a rough time, even in Legacy, because you really need the medevacs to be able to heal your Marines after you stem. I spoke about how this was very similar to a Brood War game. It's a classic thing in Brood War for the Zerg to run in with his mutas, for you to stem a control group of Marines, and for the Zerg to run away, and then your medics sit there and waste their energy having to heal your Marines. And this is a concept that carried over to StarCraft 2, just not to the same extent, because the medevac is one of the best fucking units in the game, and you can be like Marine King and build 20 of them and be fine. And whenever there was no Liberator either, and no mine, Terran players, of course, will always float gas whenever they go bio, because the way the mule works, and the Marine, and the reactor on the Vrax. So what you end up seeing is they float gas, and the way that Marine King specifically dealt with that was he would like sometimes make a second port, or just make like infinity medevacs. And this was something that even before the boost existed, the Ignite Afterburners, which came out in HOTS, it was really good. Because essentially what you see in this game is a player who doesn't have medevacs being harassed to death by mutas. The Marines can stem and fight, and you never want to fight mutas into Marines, but IdrA makes it work here, and you can see all the turrets up in the main. This if you were to like retexture this, you'd be like, oh, it's a Brood War game. There's like 12 turrets spread across 2 bases, and the Terran's on extended 2 base is having trouble defending, and the Zerg's third isn't drones at all. This looked a lot like a Brood War game. And a lot of games at the beginning of StarCraft 2 were Brood War centric, but make no mistake, like IdrA definitely understood how to go Mutiling Baneling, StarCraft 2 style, and was one of the pioneers of that. But this game specifically was so weird, he delayed Banelings for so long, and the way that the harass worked was just beautiful. So the way this group works is Genius is in it as well, who's a very talented toss player, and IdrA's hero, Nada, the Korean Terran player, legend, multi-time fucking champion from Brood War, who IdrA once said, I learned to play StarCraft 2 off of a Nada replay pack, and those guys are going to meet in one of these subsequent videos, so make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell. Easy.